Seriously, this is a courtroom? I've seen better jokes on TikTok.
The moment it happened, the courtroom stopped breathing. The mayor's daughter leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms and smirked. Not nervously, not by accident, but with the kind of confidence that comes from growing up believing rules are for other people. Then she said it, just loud enough for the microphones to catch and for the cameras to immortalize forever. "This whole thing is a joke." A few people in the gallery gasped. Someone let out a nervous laugh and immediately regretted it. Even the bailiff stiffened. But the real shock wasn't the insult itself, it was what happened next. Judge Judy didn't look up. She didn't react. She didn't correct her. She simply lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her and went completely still. No anger. No warning. No lecture. And in that silence, something far more unsettling took shape, because this wasn't the reaction of a judge who'd just been disrespected. It was the reaction of a judge who was already finished listening. What the mayor's daughter didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the case had already been decided before those words ever left her mouth. Not emotionally. Not out of spite. But on the facts. On the record. On something Judge Judy had seen long before the cameras rolled that morning. The insult didn't change the outcome. It only changed how brutal the lesson was about to be. And here's the part that makes this moment so hard to look away from. Calling the courtroom a joke wasn't even the worst thing she said that day. It wasn't the most revealing thing. It wasn't the sentence that sealed her fate. That came later, when she got comfortable, careless, and convinced that her last name would carry her through the way it always had. If you believe that no family name, no political office, and no amount of power should ever put someone above the law, you're going to want to stay for this. And honestly, this is one of those moments where people instinctively tap like, not because they're asked to, but because something inside them agrees that what's about to happen is necessary. Because from this point forward, the story doesn't get lighter. It gets uncomfortable. It gets revealing. And by the time the verdict is read, that smirk will be gone, replaced by a silence far louder than her insult ever was. On paper, the case was almost painfully ordinary. No dramatic accusations. No life-altering sums of money. No complicated legal theories. It was the kind of dispute that passes through courtrooms every single day without anyone remembering it an hour later. A simple violation that could have been resolved with a phone call, a check, or a quiet apology. The sort of issue most people handle before it ever reaches a judge. The complaint itself was straightforward. A minor infraction tied to everyday responsibility, the kind of situation where accountability usually ends the moment someone says, "That's on me." No injuries. No long-term damage. No one's future hanging in the balance. In fact, the amount in question was so small that many people in the gallery would have paid it just to avoid the inconvenience of showing up at all. And that's exactly what made everything that followed so unsettling. Because from the very beginning, it was clear this case didn't escalate because it was serious. It escalated because someone decided it was beneath them. The plaintiff, an ordinary American with no connections, no title, and no audience, wasn't asking for revenge or sympathy. They weren't even angry. They came prepared, organized, and visibly uncomfortable being there at all. They explained what happened in plain language. No dramatics. No exaggeration. Just facts, dates, and a quiet expectation that the system would work the way it's supposed to. This never needed to become a spectacle. The issue could have been resolved the first time the notice was issued. It could have been handled the second time it was ignored. It could have ended before lawyers, cameras, or courtrooms ever entered the picture. At every step along the way, there were opportunities to de-escalate, to take responsibility, to treat the matter with the seriousness it deserved, even if that seriousness was minimal. But instead of resolution, there was resistance. Instead of cooperation, there was dismissal. Instead of accountability, there was attitude. The defendant didn't dispute the basic facts of the case. That's what made it even stranger. This wasn't a story about innocence or guilt in the traditional sense. It wasn't about whether something happened, it was about whether it mattered. And from the moment she spoke, it was obvious she believed it didn't. Her posture said it all. This was an inconvenience, not a responsibility. A formality, not a rule. Something to get through, not something to answer for. The tone wasn't defensive or anxious, it was bored. As if the entire process was an interruption to something more important happening elsewhere in her life. And that's where the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Because for the person on the other side of the courtroom, This wasn't trivial. It was time taken off work. Money that mattered. A system they trusted to be fair, even when the other person clearly didn't respect it. The contrast was stark and it didn't require commentary. Anyone watching could feel it. Viewers often expect courtroom drama to begin with conflict. Raised voices, emotional accusations, heated exchanges. But here the tension came from how unnecessary all of it was. From the realization that this case existed not because it was complex, but because someone refused to treat a simple obligation as binding. That's the thought that settles into your mind as the details unfold. Why is she acting like this over something so small? And more importantly, if this is how she behaves when the stakes are low, what happens when they're not? Because this wasn't about money. It wasn't about paperwork. It wasn't even about the violation itself anymore. It was about the quiet assumption that some people don't have to play by the same rules as everyone else. That the inconvenience of accountability should simply disappear when paired with the right last name. The calm, almost boring nature of the case only amplified the arrogance surrounding it. There was no justification for hostility. No excuse for contempt. No reason for disrespect. And yet, that's exactly what continued to surface. Not loudly, not explosively, but persistently. This should have been over in minutes. Instead, it became something else entirely. Because when entitlement walks into a courtroom, even the smallest case has a way of revealing much bigger truths. She didn't enter the courtroom the way most people do, quietly, carefully, aware of where they were. She walked in like someone arriving late to a meeting she never believed she needed to attend. Her pace was unhurried. Her expression was detached. There was no hesitation in her body language, no uncertainty in her eyes. This wasn't nerves. It was familiarity. The kind that comes from growing up around power and never questioning whether it would protect you. Before she even sat down, she glanced around the room with a look that suggested she'd already categorized everyone in it. The benches. The gallery. The cameras. Nothing impressed her. Nothing concerned her. When she took her seat, she leaned back instead of forward. Crossed her legs. Let out a quiet sigh that didn't sound stressed. It sounded inconvenienced. As the clerk called the case, she whispered something to the person beside her and smirked. When her name was spoken, she corrected the pronunciation without looking up, adding a subtle emphasis that carried more meaning than the words themselves. A reminder. A signal. A way of saying, you know who I am. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted to her phone. Not openly, not defiantly, casually. The way someone checks the time when they already know it doesn't matter. A quick glance at the screen. A faint smile. A dismissive tap. As if whatever was happening in that courtroom ranked somewhere below the notifications waiting for her attention. There was no effort to hide her boredom. When she spoke, it wasn't to address the issue at hand. It was to clarify something unrelated. A schedule conflict. A comment about how long the process might take. A remark about how she'd never had to deal with something like this before. Each sentence carried the same undertone. This was beneath her. At one point, she mentioned her father, not directly, not dramatically, just enough to make sure it landed. A passing reference. A casual detail. The kind of name drop designed to float in the air without being challenged. She didn't look around to see who noticed. She assumed everyone did. Across the room, the contrast was impossible to miss. The plaintiff sat upright, hands folded over a stack of papers they'd clearly reviewed more than once. Their shoulders were tense. Their breathing shallow. They weren't checking a phone. They weren't whispering. They weren't trying to project confidence or superiority. They were focused, on the judge, on the process, on getting through this the right way. When their name was called, they stood immediately. Not too fast. Not too slow. Their voice was steady, but only because they were making it that way. This wasn't comfort. This was effort. The kind of effort people make when they know they don't have room to be careless. They answered questions directly. Yes or no when appropriate. Clarification when asked. They didn't interrupt. They didn't editorialize. They waited their turn even when it was clear they wanted to explain more. There was respect in the way they spoke. Not forced, not performative, just instinctive. And that's when the imbalance truly set in. One side treated the courtroom like a temporary inconvenience. The other treated it like a place where outcomes mattered. One side assumed the rules were flexible. The other assumed they were fixed. The difference didn't need to be pointed out. It sat there, heavy and unmistakable, for everyone watching to absorb on their own. Throughout it all, Judge Judy remained measured. She didn't rush. She didn't interrupt. She asked procedural questions, calm, precise, almost mundane. Names, dates, confirmation of details already on record. She let each side speak, especially the one that seemed most eager to fill the silence. The more the mayor's daughter talked, the more comfortable she became. The more she leaned into her tone. The more she explained things that didn't need explaining. The more she revealed without realizing it. This wasn't interrogation. It was allowance. Because when people believe they're untouchable, they tend to talk. And Judge Judy let her. She didn't challenge the attitude yet. She didn't correct the dismissiveness. She didn't react to the subtle eye rolls or the whispered comments. She simply listened, eyes occasionally dropping to the paperwork in front of her, then lifting again with quiet attention. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like patience. To anyone paying close attention, it was something else entirely. It was space. Space for confidence to turn into carelessness. Space for assumptions to turn into statements. Space for entitlement to reveal itself without being prompted. The mayor's daughter mistook that silence for indifference. Mistook the lack of immediate pushback for permission. And with each passing moment, she grew more assured that this would end the way things always did, quickly, favorably, and without consequence. Meanwhile, the plaintiff sat still, waiting. Not smiling. Not reacting. Just holding on to their documents, trusting that the truth didn't need theatrics to survive. The tension wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet and tightening, like a wire being pulled slowly but deliberately. Nothing had happened yet. And somehow, everything already had. It didn't happen all at once. The shift was gradual, almost subtle, like watching patients were thin in slow motion. At first, her tone stayed controlled, polite enough to sound reasonable, detached enough to feel dismissive. She spoke as if she were explaining something obvious to people who simply didn't understand her world. The case, she suggested, was being blown out of proportion. The issue was minor. The consequences exaggerated. In her words, it was petty. Not worth this much time. Not worth this much attention. She leaned forward just enough to make it feel like she was trying to help everyone move on. She pointed out how long she'd already been sitting there. Mentioned other obligations waiting for her. Commented on how surprising it was that something so small had made it this far. Each remark landed softly, wrapped in a tone of disbelief rather than open hostility. But underneath it was the same message repeated again and again. This shouldn't apply to me. As she kept talking, that disbelief turned into impatience. She questioned why the court was even entertaining the matter. Why resources were being spent on something she clearly saw as insignificant. She framed herself as the reasonable one, the person trying to streamline a system bogged down by unnecessary formalities. The words weren't shouted. They weren't dramatic. They were casual. And that made them worse. At one point, she gestured lightly toward the bench, smiling as if sharing an inside joke with the room. She spoke about how public proceedings like this often felt performative. How cases like hers were dragged out for appearances. How the process sometimes mattered more than the outcome. She didn't say it with contempt, she said it with amusement. That's when the air in the courtroom began to change. Because this was no longer about the violation, or the paperwork, or even the disagreement itself. It had quietly become about respect, and the absence of it. The plaintiff remained still. Hands folded. Eyes forward. They didn't interrupt. Didn't react. Didn't rise to the moment in any visible way. But the contrast between the two sides was growing sharper with every sentence. One person was trying to resolve a problem. The other was trying to minimize the existence of the process itself. And then she went one step further. She tilted her head slightly and laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly, but confidently. The kind of laugh that assumes agreement. The kind that expects the room to follow along. She shook her head and said it plainly, without hesitation, without calculation. This is honestly a joke. The word landed harder than anything else she'd said. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Someone inhaled sharply. Even the plaintiff looked up for the first time, eyes flicking toward her in disbelief. But she didn't notice any of it, or didn't care to. She let the laugh linger as if the statement needed punctuation. In that instant, viewers know something irreversible has just happened. Because calling a legal process petty is one thing. Suggesting inefficiency is another. But calling the court itself a joke, especially in that room at that bench, crosses a line that doesn't get uncrossed. It wasn't frustration speaking. It wasn't stress. It was entitlement laid bare. For the first time since the hearing began, the tone stopped drifting and snapped into focus. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't react outwardly at all. She didn't correct the language or issue a warning. She simply looked up, slowly, and held the defendant's gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Long enough for the room to feel it. Long enough for the laughter to fade on its own. The silence that followed was heavier than the insult. Because everyone watching understood what the defendant didn't yet realize. This was no longer about whether she owed something, or whether the matter was small. It was about how she saw the law, and how the law was about to respond. Viewers lean in at this moment because they recognize the point of no return. The moment where confidence turns into exposure. Where someone who believed they were untouchable forgets that the rules apply most strictly to those who think they don't. She shifted in her seat, still smiling, still comfortable, still convinced she'd said nothing that truly mattered. But the atmosphere around her had changed. The court was no longer indulging her tone. The patience in the room wasn't agreement, it was restraint. And restraint, when it finally breaks, is far more devastating than anger. What she didn't know, what she still didn't know, was that this single word would echo back to her later. Not as an argument. Not as a reprimand. But as evidence. Because the moment she called the court a joke, she unknowingly made herself the punchline. Judge Judy didn't respond to the insult the way most people expected. She didn't correct the language. She didn't lecture. She didn't even acknowledge it directly. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She shifted the focus away from attitude and onto facts. She glanced down at the file in front of her and asked, calmly, almost casually, for the records. Not opinions. Not explanations. Not excuses. Just the records. The request was simple. Neutral. Procedural. And it immediately changed the temperature in the room. The mayor's daughter hesitated for the first time. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. A brief pause. A glance to the side. A subtle adjustment in posture. Until now, she'd been speaking freely, confidently, comfortably. Now her answers came slower. Less polished. She handed over what she had with the same dismissive expression, clearly expecting it to confirm her version of events and end the discussion. Judge Judy didn't look at her while reviewing the documents. She read quietly, flipping pages with deliberate patience. Dates. Signatures. Notices. A timeline that was forming line by line. The courtroom stayed silent, not because anyone was told to be quiet, but because everyone could feel something shifting beneath the surface. Then Judge Judy asked her first follow-up question. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't sharp. It was precise. She asked her to confirm a date, one the defendant had already referenced earlier with confidence. The mayor's daughter answered quickly, without hesitation. The date rolled off her tongue as if it had been rehearsed. Judge Judy nodded once and turned a page. Then she asked another question. Another date. Another confirmation. The defendant answered again, still certain, still relaxed. But now there was a crack in the rhythm. A faint edge of uncertainty. The answers were no longer automatic. Because the timeline wasn't lining up. Judge Judy didn't point that out immediately. She let the inconsistency sit there. Let it breathe. Let the defendant continue explaining herself, adding details, filling in gaps that didn't need filling. With every added sentence, the story grew more complicated and less accurate. That's when the unraveling began. Judge Judy calmly read aloud a line from the record. A notice that had been sent weeks earlier than the defendant claimed. Then another. Documentation showing acknowledgement. Confirmation of receipt. Evidence that the issue hadn't been a surprise, and it certainly hadn't been new. The mayor's daughter shifted in her seat again. This time she didn't smile. She tried to adjust her story, subtly at first, clarifying that she meant a different date, suggesting there had been confusion, implying that someone else handled the details. But Judge Judy wasn't following her explanations anymore. She was following the paper trail. And the paper trail was unforgiving. Each piece of evidence contradicted something the defendant had already said. Not dramatically. Not explosively. Quietly. Methodically. In a way that made it impossible to argue without sounding careless. The judge looked up then, not with anger but with recognition. She asked one more question. A question that didn't seem connected at first. A question about a prior notice. A separate matter. Something that wasn't supposed to be part of this case at all. The mayor's daughter froze. Because Judge Judy already knew the answer. What hadn't been revealed yet, what the defendant was just beginning to realize, was that this wasn't the first time her name had crossed that desk. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. There was a pattern. And Judge Judy had seen it before the hearing ever began. She didn't say that outright. Not yet. Instead, she referenced the prior issue gently, almost as if giving the defendant a chance to explain herself. To correct the record. To show awareness. But the mayor's daughter brushed it off, dismissing it the same way she dismissed everything else. That dismissal was the confirmation Judge Judy needed. Because now it was clear this wasn't about confusion. It was about habit. About someone who had learned, over time, that ignoring obligations rarely came with consequences. Until now. This is usually the moment people realize respect matters. The moment when confidence collapses under the weight of facts. And if stories where arrogance turns into accountability are your kind of thing, this is also the moment when most viewers instinctively subscribe, because they know the verdict is coming, and they don't want to miss what happens when entitlement finally meets resistance. Judge Judy closed the file slowly and placed her hands on the bench. The mayor's daughter, who had walked in certain this case was a joke, was now staring at a record she couldn't laugh away. And for the first time that day, the room wasn't waiting to hear her speak. It was waiting to hear the judge. Judge Judy didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She didn't signal for order or deliver a warning. She simply looked at the defendant and began speaking in the same calm tone she'd used all morning, which somehow made every word land harder. She started by repeating the defendant's own language back to her. Slowly. Precisely. Without adding anything to it. She referenced the moment the case was called petty. The suggestion that the court was a waste of time. And finally, the word that had shifted everything, a joke. Judge Judy didn't say it with anger. She didn't emphasize it. She let it sit there exactly as it had been spoken. Then she paused. And in that pause, the weight of those words changed. What had sounded casual moments earlier now sounded reckless. Immature. Exposed. Judge Judy explained in measured terms that courtrooms don't exist to entertain people who are bored. They exist to resolve disputes fairly, whether the amount is large or small. She reminded her that the size of a case doesn't determine its importance. The principle does. And the principle she made clear was responsibility. The mayor's daughter tried to interrupt once. Just once. A short sentence, half-formed as if to soften what had already been said. Judge Judy raised a hand, not sharply, not dramatically, and continued speaking without breaking her rhythm. She addressed the assumption that had been floating in the room since the defendant arrived. The idea that status changes standards. That influence reshapes outcomes. That the rules bend quietly for people who know the right names. Then she dismantled it. She explained that her father's position was irrelevant. That titles don't transfer. That political power doesn't enter the courtroom unless it's on the record, and in this case it wasn't. She stated plainly that the law doesn't recognize family trees. It recognizes evidence. And then came the line that shifted the room entirely. Your father's title doesn't enter this courtroom with you. It wasn't delivered as a rebuke. It was delivered as a fact. As unchangeable as gravity. Judge Judy continued, walking through the evidence again, not to overwhelm but to clarify. She pointed out how the records contradicted the narrative. How the timeline disproved the excuses. How the repeated dismissals weren't misunderstandings but choices. She explained that entitlement isn't loud, it's casual. It shows up in skipped steps. Ignored notices. Smiles where seriousness is required. She made it clear that the problem wasn't a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. The problem was the refusal to acknowledge one. As she spoke, the mayor's daughter's posture changed. The leaning back stopped. The crossed arms fell away. Her eyes dropped to the table, not in defiance but in calculation, trying to understand how something so small had slipped so completely out of her control. Judge Judy didn't press her. She didn't ask rhetorical questions. She didn't accuse her of lying. She simply explained why the story didn't hold up and why it didn't need to. The facts had already done that work. What made the moment so powerful wasn't humiliation. It was disappointment. Judge Judy explained that the court expects better behavior from everyone, especially from people who've had every advantage. She said that respect for the law isn't proven by confidence, but by compliance. And that treating the process as optional is a privilege the system doesn't offer. She looked directly at the defendant and said something quietly devastating, that the court had been patient, but patience isn't permission. That silence isn't agreement. And that being allowed to speak freely doesn't mean the words won't matter later. The mayor's daughter nodded once. Not in understanding, in recognition. The kind that comes when someone realizes the performance they believed in no longer has an audience. Judge Judy closed by stating that this case was never about power. It was about accountability. And accountability, she reminded the room, doesn't negotiate with entitlement. It corrects it. By the time she finished speaking, there was no anger in the air. No tension. Just clarity. Viewers watching this moment don't feel satisfaction because someone was yelled at. They feel it because someone was seen, completely, unmistakably, for who they were in that moment. And because the law responded not with emotion but with precision. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. And for someone who walked into the courtroom believing the rules didn't apply to her, that realization was far more punishing than any raised voice ever could be. The verdict didn't come with drama. No pause for effect. No raised voice. No performance. It arrived the same way everything else had that day, controlled, deliberate, and impossible to argue with. Judge Judy looked down at the file one final time, then back up at the defendant. Her voice was steady, almost neutral as she summarized the findings. The facts were clear. The timeline was clear. The record spoke for itself. Responsibility had been established, not because of attitude, not because of arrogance, but because the evidence left no room for interpretation. She delivered the judgment cleanly. The financial consequence was stated plainly. Not inflated. Not symbolic. Real. The kind of number that doesn't just close a case, it corrects behavior. The legal outcome followed just as matter-of-factly, reinforcing that this wasn't a warning or a suggestion. It was a ruling entered into record, carrying the same weight it would for anyone else who sat in that chair. Then came the part no one could write off. Judge Judy addressed the conduct. She explained that while courts exist to resolve disputes, they also exist to uphold respect for the process itself. That dismissiveness toward the law isn't harmless. That treating accountability like an inconvenience doesn't make it disappear, it exposes it. And that reputation isn't damaged by consequences. It's damaged by the behavior that makes consequences necessary. The mayor's daughter didn't respond. She didn't interrupt. She didn't object. She didn't laugh this time. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by stillness. Her shoulders tightened. Her eyes dropped. Her hands rested flat on the table, motionless. Silence followed, not the awkward kind but the final kind. Across the courtroom, the plaintiff exhaled. It wasn't dramatic. There was no visible celebration. Just a quiet release of tension that had been carried longer than anyone should have to carry something so small. Their posture relaxed slightly. Their grip on the papers loosened. Justice didn't arrive with applause, it arrived with relief. Judge Judy concluded with a final statement that wasn't aimed at one person, but at the principle behind the case. She said that power without humility collapses under scrutiny. That influence doesn't excuse obligation. That the law doesn't recognize last names, titles, or family connections, only actions and evidence. And that courtrooms are not stages for ego, but places where responsibility is measured. With that, she closed the file. The case was over. The mayor's daughter stood up more slowly this time. There was no correction of pronunciation. No whispered comments. No phone check. Just quiet compliance. The kind that comes after certainty is removed. She walked out without looking back, carrying something far heavier than a fine or a ruling. She carried the realization that entitlement doesn't survive exposure. For viewers, this is the moment that lingers. Not because someone was embarrassed. Not because someone lost. But because accountability won, calmly, clearly, and without apology. It's the reminder people don't realize they're craving until they see it happen. That the system can still work when evidence is respected, when authority isn't intimidated, and when power is told no without hesitation. And if you believe accountability still matters in this country, if you believe no one should be above the law no matter their last name, this is exactly the kind of story worth sharing. Stories where confidence meets consequence. where arrogance meets record, where power finally meets a boundary it can't cross. Subscribe for more moments like this. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're necessary.